Alright, so I'm Albert and I'll be doing my persuasive speech on the Syrian refugee crisis and how it relates to ISIS. So take a look at these four pictures. What do they all have in common? Well, for one, they were all terrorist attacks and they've all been perpetrated by ISIS. Now you may know the Paris attacks, the Brussels attacks, and the San Bernardino attack, but did you know that at the same time as the San Bernardino attack, there was an attack on UC Merced by a student who stabbed 4 others, and thankfully they did not die, only the attacker was killed by police after the engagement. So these were all examples of recent attacks within the past year that have occurred and been inspired or related to ISIS. Now take a look at this map. It was produced by CNN, and basically these circles represent different attacks that were related to or inspired by ISIS. The different colors, I don't know if you see on the bottom left there's a legend. The orange color shows attacks that were inspired by ISIS. Blue ones were directly related to them or carried out by them. As you can see, the majority are in the Middle East region. However, there's a significant amount in Europe and in North America. This next slide is the same map, however zoomed in on North America. And as you can see, there have been 7 ISIS-linked attacks since 2014 by Syrians who have infiltrated North America, 5 of which are in the United States, 2 in Canada, and 2 out of those 5 were in California. Both of them were on the previous slides that I showed, the UC Merced attack and the San Bernardino attack. According to the Business Insider, the high affinity for Syrians to be affiliated with terrorist organizations poses a substantial risk if they were to be easily allowed into the United States. So what is ISIS? In brief summary, ISIS stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Obama and other US officials like to use ISIL, which is the same thing, however the last S is changed to L for the Levant. It's a region in the Mediterranean. And they use that for political reasons. They don't want to imply Syria because Syria itself hasn't really been involved in terrorist activities. They've sort of been forced into it. So ISIS began as an al-Qaeda faction in the early 2000s. However, they were quickly separated by al-Qaeda after al-Qaeda deemed them too militant and radical, even for al-Qaeda. They're known for their extreme violence and brutalism. You've probably seen on social media they post a lot of nasty stuff that they do and a lot of gore and terror kind of activities. They occupy more than 35,000 square miles, the majority of which is in Syria. As you can see in the bottom statistic, they've inspired over 90 terrorist attacks in only 2 years in 21 different countries, none of which include their home countries of Iraq and Syria. So the Syrian civil war, this is kind of what inspired the growth of ISIS, and it began in 2011 after a protest against the legitimate Syrian government. So their objectives of the rebels have kind of changed, but it's grown generally from a small protest to a full-scale rebellion in the country. The statistics show that there's over 250,000 Syrian civilians, people who aren't even belligerents on either side, who have been killed by the civil war, and half the Syrian population, which is around 13 million, have been displaced and forced from their homes in Syria. Naturally, a refugee crisis would occur. The majority of refugees have fled to nearby Mediterranean countries in the Levant, including Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and Greece. However, 1.5 million of those around 13 million people have claimed asylum in Europe. About 18,000 people Syrians in 2015 were admitted to the United States, and Obama in this year, 2016, plans to admit a grand total of 10,000 Syrians to the United States. However, this is troubling because 1 in 7 Syrian refugees sympathizes towards the United States, according to the Huffington Post, or has some sort of idealism that they agree with. So as you can see, these are some headlines from newspaper clippings I found. There have just been some examples of people who've claimed refugee or asylum only to later be arrested or found that they had ties to extremism or ISIS or some sort. So what solutions can we develop? Well, currently we're working on a very aggressive and direct approach, bombings. Russia has shown this very carefully to be a not very effective technique. In October of last year, they began airstrikes However, airstrikes just destroy things and they create more refugees. The US has followed suit. They've also bombed a lot, and they haven't really tried to make an effort, they tried to kind of follow along with other countries, especially Russia and France. Over 3,000 of their airstrikes in about 2 years have been carried out by the United States. However, according to the Huffington Post, if all we do is to destroy ISIS, other terrorist organizations will spring up in what will continue to be an ungoverned space. In my opinion, I think we should work on humanitarian efforts. In the early 2000s, the Taliban acquired 90% of their forces from orphanages. If we were to keep bombing areas and create orphans, they would all just end up in terrorist organizations like the Taliban and ISIS. Most Muslims agree that Western countries are fairly good and they resist terrorist ideals. I think it's important for us as a modern, developed Western country to not support a reduction of refugees based on their culture, their race, or religion, but rather to support progressive movements to admit them into our country. I also believe that Syrian countries, just like any other humans, are just like any other humans. However, they lack many access to basic food, water, infrastructure, healthcare, education. And lastly, I believe that we should focus on education rather than trying to actively go after a small group of extremists. We should educate the majority population to resist extremism and promote democracy. So in US politics, it's kind of a tricky subject. However, these are what most of the candidates view. Trump is kind of very extreme, banning Muslims at all from entering the US. However, that kind of affects the legitimate Muslims. Cruz kind of on the same board. He thinks that only Christians should be allowed in. Clinton on the exact opposite, she suggests allowing 65,000 refugees. They're both bad. Clinton wants too many, Trump and Cruz don't want any at all. And as you see at the bottom, 31 states do not allow refugees at all, in any form, to claim asylum. And all but one are Republican. So all of them are Democratic, or Democratic-leaning in their voting practices, surprisingly. So what can you do? Well, there's three main things I think you can do. One is donate, and it doesn't have to be monetary. It can be anything you really have, and there's places you can donate anywhere. It doesn't have to be directly to the UN Refugees Agency. There's many small sub-agencies that operate on behalf of the UN Refugee Agency that accept anything, toys, clothes, whatever you can give. Be informed. I think keep an open mind. In light of the recent attacks, even in California, where a lot of them hit close to home, I think we should keep an open mind, especially about the Muslim population and Syrian refugees, and just try not to rely on stereotypes. Lastly, I think border closing legislations, we should vote against them. In the House, they've actually voted for border closing legislations to keep Syrian refugees out. However, I think if we have the chance, we should vote to keep them open and focus more on internal policies which can help us crack down on the one or two bad guys which may try to get through. Okay, that's it.